Greetings. This is the first podcast which relates the timeline of events related to the Civil War in Indiana. This episode ends just before Morgan's raid, February 11th, 1861. Abraham Lincoln gave a speech at State Line, Indiana. President-elect Abraham Lincoln departed his home in Springfield, Illinois on February the 11th, 1861 to travel by train to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration as President of the United States. His first stop was at State Line, Indiana, to give a speech. Railroads, the Great Western Railroad and the Toledo, Wabash, and Western Railway crossed paths on the Indiana and Illinois state lines. Robert Casement platted the state line at this intersection on June the 29th, 1857. By the time of Lincoln's visit, the town had grown to almost 500 people. The town became known as an unsavory spot due to the riotous escapades of the drinking railroad men. On April 17, 1861, the first Indiana volunteers arrived at Camp Morton. Indiana would play a critical role in the Civil War. By population, it was the fifth largest state remaining in the Union, and central location and agricultural production were also key to the state's importance. Governor Oliver P. Morton had appointed native Hoosier and Mexican War veteran Lew Wallace as adjutant general in charge of choosing the site for an Army training camp and organizing it. Confederate troops had fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April the 12th, 1861. By April the 14th, 1861, Indiana Governor Oliver Morton offered to raise 10 regiments or 10,000 men in response to President Abraham Lincoln's call for troops to put down the Southern Rebellion. Raising this many recruits created the need for a recruiting and training camp. After surveying the land around Indianapolis, the only suitable place found was the land used as the Indiana State Fairgrounds, established in 1852. Thus, the 36-acre State Fairgrounds became a Union Army training camp and recruitment facility. Named Camp Morton in honor of the governor, the camp came under his direct administration. On April the 17th, 3 days after Morton had issued his call for troops, volunteers began arriving at the camp to offer their service. Most historians consider the Battle of Philippi as the first organized land battle of the Civil War. Six regiments from Indiana, which had organized in mid to late April, participated in the battle. Major General George B. McClellan had assumed command of the Department of the Ohio, a military district created to manage Union troops at the start of the Civil War. The headquarters of the Department of the Ohio was at Cincinnati, Ohio. McClellan wanted to occupy western Virginia, an area known to be largely pro-Union. Brigadier General Thomas A. Morris, commander of the Indiana Volunteers, joined McClellan to join the offensive, which McClellan hoped to turn into assault on the Confederate capital at Richmond. On May the 28th, 1861, McClellan placed Indiana Brigadier General Thomas Morris in command of 3,000 troops and dispatched him to Wheeling, Virginia, across the Ohio River into Virginia. From Wheeling, the Union troops advanced towards Confederate troops at Grafton. Confederate General George A. Porterfield commanded Confederate forces in western Virginia. His situation was desperate. Union sentiment in the area was strong, and most residents were opposed to the April 17th Ordinance of Sensation passed by the Virginia State Assembly. Porterfield had attempted to recruit soldiers in Grafton, Virginia, with little success. Of the men he did manage to recruit, only 2 companies had guns. Porterfield waited in Grafton for reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies. The wait was in vain, as nothing came through. He learned of the Union advance. Knowing his troops were in no condition for battle, he retreated to the little town of Philippi. Then he waited. Union troops advanced on Philippi during the evening of June 2nd. Neither the Union commanders or the Confederate commanders had accurate intelligence of the numbers or situation of their opponents. Both sides believed that enemy strength was greater than it really was, and Morris did not know about the almost helpless state of the Confederate forces. During the night, Union forces moved to surround the town. Due to an unknown mix-up, Union forces left the southern roads open. Attacking at dawn, the Union forces caught the Confederates completely by surprise. The sudden attack entirely demoralized the Confederates, most of whom abandoned their arms and fled down the South Road. The rout was so complete that Union troops called it the races at Philippi. Most military historians regard this as more of a skirmish than a battle. No Union soldiers were killed, and Confederate casualties were scanty. The ease of the victory created a false sense of superiority among Union forces, who now expected the Confederates to collapse when faced with Union forces. The Union movements did set up later actions that would clear the region of Confederates, allowing the people in the area to secede from Virginia and form the state of West Virginia. Regiments from Indiana that served in this battle are the 6th Indiana Regiment, the 7th Indiana Regiment, the 8th Indiana Regiment, the 9th Indiana Regiment, the 10th Indiana Regiment, and the 13th Indiana Regiment. Brigadier General Thomas A. Morris was in command of the Indiana troops. On July the 5th, 1861, the 14th Indiana Infantry Regiment organized, and on July the 31st, 1861, the 24th Indiana Infantry mustered. On October the 24th, 1861, the 44th Indiana Infantry mustered. This was organized at Fort Wayne's Camp Allen. They mustered into service on October the 24th, 1861. December the 30th, 1861, 40th Indiana Infantry mustered into action. I will describe the histories of these regiments later in the section that covers that will be dealing with Indiana regiments. On February the 5th, 1862, Senator Jesse Bright was expelled from the United States Senate. Charged with being a traitor, Bright's Senate colleagues voted to expel him after the capture of an arms dealer. Thomas Lincoln revealed a letter which Bright acknowledged Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederacy. Jesse Bright lived from December the 18th, 1812 until May the 20th, 1875. Born in Norwich, New York, Bright's parents moved to Madison, Indiana in 1812 when he was 8 years old. After studying law, he gained admittance to the bar in 1831 and opened practice in law. His forceful personality led to his rapid rise in politics. Jefferson County probate judge in 1834 to the Democratic lieutenant governor in 1842. The state assembly elected him senator in 1844. As Senate pro tempore, he was the acting vice president of the United States after Vice President William B. King died in office. Bright was a strident defender of slavery. He owned a farm in Kentucky and had 20 slaves working on it. He considered abolitionists his enemies and took pains to punish his opponents that disagreed with him. When war broke out, he became one of only 10 Democrats left in the Senate against 29 Republicans when most of the Democratic members absented themselves due to the secession of their home states. His troubles in the Senate multiplied when federal troops captured a Texas arm dealer trying to cross into Confederate territory. Senator Bright had written the letter, dated March the 1st, 1861, as an introduction of Lincoln, a former client, to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. I don't think Mr. Lincoln has any relation to President Abraham Lincoln. However, I haven't checked that out. Anyway, the letter stated as followed, quote, His Excellency Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. My dear sir, allow me to introduce to your acquaintance my friend Thomas B. Lincoln of Texas. He visits your capital mainly to dispose of what he regards a great improvement in firearms. I recommend him to your favorable consideration as a gentleman of the first respectability and reliable in every respect. The letter, unquote. The letter was damning on several points. He wrote it during the time that Davis was gathering military supplies for the attack on Fort Sumter, and in the address he acknowledged Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederacy. Many of his colleagues considered Davis as the ultimate traitor. His political enemies, and there were many, used it as a tool to unseat him and further weaken the Democratic Party in the Senate. On December the 16th, 1861, Minnesota Senator, I don't have his name. Anyway, a Minnesota senator introduced a resolution calling for Bright's expulsion. Debate that consumed several months followed. On January the 13th, 1862, the Judiciary Committee that had investigated the affair reported that the charges were not sufficient for expulsion. After the report, one committee member, Connecticut Republican Lafayette Foster, changed his mind and recommended expulsion. The Senate debate began on January the 20th and lasted until February the 5th, when the Senate voted 32 to 14 to expel him. Shortly afterward, the Union Army confiscated land he owned in Jeffersonville, Indiana, to use to build Jeffersonville's General Hospital, a hospital used to treat wounded Union soldiers. February the 22nd, 1862, first Confederate prisoner of war camp opens at Camp Morton. Confederate troops first fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April the 12th, 1861. On April the 14th, 1861, Indiana Governor Oliver Morton offered to raise 10 regiments or 10,000 men in response to President Abraham Lincoln's call for troops to put down the Southern Rebellion. Raising this many recruits created a need for a recruiting and training camp. After surveying the land around Indianapolis, the only suitable place found was the land used at the state fairgrounds established in 1852. Thus, the 36-acre state fairgrounds became a Union Army trading camp and recruitment facility, named Camp Morton in honor of the governor. The camp came under his direct administration. Conversion to a prisoner of war camp followed. Union victories at Fort Donelson in February 1862 created another need. The Union Army had captured thousands of Confederate soldiers. There was a need to house these prisoners somewhere. Union General Henry W. Halleck dispatched a request by telegraph for prisoner of war facilities, and Governor Morton agreed to take up to 3,000 prisoners on February the 17th, 1863. Morton assigned Assistant Quartermaster Captain James A. Eakin the task of converting the camp from a training camp to a prisoner of war facility. Eakin oversaw the conversion of livestock stalls into barracks, the installation of a wooden stockade wall around the camp. Workers installed entry gates, guard towers, sentry walkways. Workers also installed latrines. 5 wells provided water. Work had not completed on the camp when the first trains arrived on February the 22nd, 1862, with the first prisoners. The prisoner population increased to over 4,000 prisoners by April. The Army took over administration of the camp with the arrival of the first prisoners. The camp remained crowded until August 1862, when Union and Confederate armies completed a general prisoner exchange. Camp Morton again became a training camp. By early 1863, there was again need for a prisoner of war camp, and the facility was converted again. The last prisoners were paroled on June the 12th, 1865. During its operation, the camp housed an average of 3,214 prisoners, with a maximum of 4,900 in July of 1864. The deaths at the camp totaled 1,700, or about 50 a month. The dead soldiers were interred at Crown Hill Cemetery. After the war, the grounds reverted to the Indiana State Fairgrounds, which used the site until 1891. The Camp Morton site has since been platted and used as a residential neighborhood known as Morton Place. On January the 18th, 1862, the Newburgh Raid occurred. In a precursor to Hines' Raid and Morgan's Raid, Confederate Colonel Adam Rankin Johnson captured the town of Newburgh, Indiana, using 2 Quaker dams as a ruse to subdue the town and to his nickname, Doughpipe Johnson. Adam Rankin Johnson lived from February the 6th, 1834 until October the 20th, 1922. The son of Thomas J. and Juliet Rankin Johnson, Adam was native to Henderson, Kentucky. He started working at a local drugstore at age 12, then migrated to Texas to become a surveyor and noted Indian fighter. When the Civil War broke out, he returned to Kentucky, raising the 10th Indiana Partisan Rangers there. This unit specialized in operating deep behind Union lines, harassing supply depots, and attacking isolated garrisons of Union troops. After his July 16, 1862 raid on Newburgh, he accompanied Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan's raid through southern Indiana. A gunfiring accident blinded him, causing his capture by Union troops in 1864. Most of the remainder of the war he spent as a prisoner. He would later found the town Marble Falls, Texas, also known as Blind Man's Town. Quaker guns were fake cannon constructed to fool an enemy. The first known use was Captain Colonel William Washington's use of a pine log configured to resemble a cannon during the Revolutionary War. The trick worked, fooling several Loyalist troops holed up in a barn into surrendering. The gun's name, Quaker guns, referred to the pacifist stance of Quakers in committing no violence. Newburgh is just east of Evansville on the Ohio River. The town was almost undefended, with about 80 Union troops there in various stages of recovering from war wounds. Their guns were stored in an unguarded warehouse on the riverfront. The commander of the Union troops, Union Bethel, had little support from the state of Indiana, receiving little in the way of aid for training his troops or weaponry. He, like many others in the town, were eating lunch when Johnson launched his noonday raid. Coincidentally, the telegraph that connected Newburgh to the outside world was also inoperative. Johnson had heard about the unprotected guns and medical supplies at the hospital where the Union troops were recovering. He wanted the guns and the supplies badly needed by his Confederates. Prior to launching his expedition across the Ohio River, Johnson had 2 Quaker guns constructed using stovepipes and blackened logs. He positioned his artillery on a bluff on a river overlooking Newburgh. Around noon, him and about 30 off 35 soldiers boarded a flatboat and a rowboat and crossed the Ohio River. Landing unopposed, the raiders confiscated the supplies they needed. Commander Bethel, hearing of the incursion, rushed out to confront the Confederates. Johnson pointed across the river at the, quote, cannon, causing Bethel to capitulate. The raid lasted about 5 hours, during which time Johnson took many things he needed. Since the telegraph was out of order, Bethel was unable to summon nearby Union troops. Johnson and his men departed Newburgh, successfully evaded Union capture. He had captured the first town north of the Mason-Dixon line without firing a shot. The raid harmed the Confederate cause more than it helped. Recruiting in Indiana shot up substantially, and Governor Morton was able to raise more money for defense. A year later, Morgan would launch his famous raid in spite of those improvements. July the 21st, 1862, the New Albany race riots occurred, and on August the 19th, 1862, the 75th Indiana Regiment mustered. I have already written about the race riots in a previous podcast, and I will cover the regiment in later podcasts dealing with Indiana infantry regiments. On September the 14th, 1862, 9 Indiana regiments fought at the Battle of Munfordville. Greensburg, Indiana resident Colonel John T. Wilder commanded the Federal garrison at Munfordville, Kentucky, that included 9 regiments from Indiana. Confederate forces attacked the garrison on September the 14th, 1862, beginning a 3-day battle that ended with Wilder surrendering his force to the Confederates. John T. Wilder, the son of Reuben and Mary Merritt Wilder, John could claim descent from heroes. His grandfather and great-grandfather saw action in the Revolutionary War. His father fought in the War of 1812 when the Civil War erupted. John Wilder would join their ranks. I've already written a biography on John Wilder in a previous podcast. Wilder enlisted, receiving the rank of private. The men of his company, the 17th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, elected him as captain. Governor Oliver P. Morton commissioned him as a lieutenant colonel, and by spring of 1862, the company found itself at the Battle of Shiloh. His performance at that battle earned him a promotion to full colonel and command of the 17th Indiana. Located in central Kentucky, Munfordville serves as the county seat of Hart County. The town derives its name from Resident Richard Jones Munford, who donated the land on which the courthouse stands. The town was established in 1816 and incorporated in 1858. Munfordville was of strategic importance due to the 1,800-foot-long railroad bridge over the Green River. The bridge belonged to the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, thus it was an important military asset. Union troops began occupation of Munfordville in December 1861, shortly after Confederate troops abandoned the town. Troops began erecting fortifications and establishing their camps soon after their arrival. The men, working with pickaxes, axes, and shovels, erected massive breastworks around the bridge and rail lines. The Confederates had also destroyed the bridge before departing. Union troops repaired the bridge. On September the 8th, Captain John T. Wilder arrived with his 17th Indiana Infantry and took command of the garrison. When he arrived, the garrison included 1,400 men of the 67th and 89th Indiana Infantries, as well as about 200 new recruits from the 33rd Kentucky Infantry. It would be Company C and G. The Kentucky 33rd did not have weapons, nor did the 214 men of the 17th. Wilder immediately began making further improvements in the fortifications. Confederate General James Ronald Chalmers led his 19th Mississippi Infantry Regiment to Munfordville to capture it. He approached Wilder on September the 13th and demanded that he surrender. Wilder refused. Chalmers attacked Union positions, which repulsed his attack. Chalmers lost about 200 soldiers in the attack, while Union losses were about 37. Confederate General Braxton Bragg heard about Chalmers' exploits and was angry because he had acted without orders. Bragg determined to capture Munfordville anyway. He and his army made a forced march of about 35 miles and on September the 16th surrounded Wilder's troops with about 25,000 men and 45 cannon. Meanwhile, on September the 15th, Wilder had received additional reinforcements as the 60th, 67th, 68th, and 74th Indiana Infantry regiments came into camp along with the 28th Kentucky Infantry, Company K, 34th Kentucky Infantry, Battery D, the 1st Ohio Light Artillery, and batteries along along with the 13th and 17th Indiana Light Artillery. Wilder's force now totaled about 4,000 men. On September the 16th, Bragg approached Wilder demanding that he surrender. Wilder demanded to see the Confederate positions. Rebel soldiers led a blindfolded Wilder behind their lines and removed the blindfold to show Wilder their overwhelming majority. Wilder, upon considering his situation, said, "Well, it seems to me that I ought to surrender." Wilder and his forces did surrender and were held as prisoners of war until November, when the Confederates and Union armies conducted a prisoner exchange and the soldiers were pardoned. The soldiers returned to war. The Union forces involved Colonel John T. Wilder, commanding Union officer, Indiana Light Artillery, 13th Battery, the 17th, the 60th, 67th, 68th, 74th, 89th Indiana Infantries, as well as the 28th, the 33rd, the 34th Kentucky Regiments, infantry regiments, the 18th U.S. Infantry Company H, under Colonel Cyrus L. Dunham, the 58th and 78th, or the 50th, I'm sorry, the 50th and the 78th Indiana Infantries, and the 1st Ohio Light Artillery Battery. On October the 21st, the 1862, the 74th Indiana Infantry mustered. September the 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day of the Civil War occurred. The 27th Regiment, the infantry regiment from Indiana, lost 75% of its strength. August the 28th, 1862, the 89th Indiana Regiment mustered. And on October the 21st, the 99th Indiana Infantry mustered. I will cover these, like I said, in a later podcast. We'll get the histories of these regiments. On November the 3rd, 1862, Dr. Richard Gatling patented a machine gun in Indianapolis. Richard Jordan Gatling lived from September the 12th, 1818 until February the 26th, 1903. The son of Jordan and Mary Barnes Gatling, Richard was native to the Maines Neck region of Hartford County, North Carolina. Jordan's father and older brother were both inventors. His father, who owned about a 1,000-acre plantation, invented a machine that planted cotton seeds and then thinned the seedlings to the proper distance apart. His brother invented a hand crank flying machine that never achieved flight. Additionally, he invented a device that chopped cotton stalks and converted native pine into lightwood, which is an easily ignitable wood used for kindling. After attending a public school, Gatling spent a short stint as a teacher. However, his genius at inventing devices surfaced. Seeking to improve the paddle wheel propulsion system used by steamboats, he invented a screw propeller. His father, unimpressed, refused to allow him to travel to Washington, D.C. to patent the device. After he finally convinced him to allow him to go to Washington, he went only to discover that John Ericsson had patented a similar device a few days earlier. 3 years later, he received his first patent for a rice planter. He migrated to St. Louis to market the rice planter, which he had adapted to sowing wheat. While there, he contracted a near fatal disease of smallpox. The difficulty he had in receiving treatment led him to attending Indiana Medical College and the Ohio Medical College. He received a medical degree in 1850 and moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, to practice medicine. He met and married Jemima Sanders, the daughter of a well-known Indianapolis doctor. The couple would have 5 children. His career as a doctor was brief. He invented a machine used to break hemp fibers and steam-powered plow. His visit to trains bringing in the dead and wounded soldiers in the early years of the Civil War led him to try to invent a weapon that would require fewer soldiers to fight in wars, thus causing fewer deaths. He also hoped the savagery of the weapon he invented would discourage war altogether. His invention involved installing 6 gun barrels around a rotating drum. The hand crank device fired rounds from belts of cartridges that were stored in drums on the top of the gun. This device was an effective killing machine, firing 200 rounds per minute. After receiving his patent on November the 3rd, 1863, he founded the Gatling Gun Company in Indianapolis. He managed to get the United States Navy to purchase some of the guns. However, the United States Army refused to buy them. He did sell sizable quantities to military organizations in Britain, France, Spain, Russia, Turkey, and Japan. A British newspaper reported that, quote, the general use of the formidable weapon will tend to diminish the barbarity and actual carnage of warfare, as it is known relentless certainty of execution will help prevent wars and thereby aid in keeping the peace in Christendom, unquote. Gatling continued to improve the gun, producing several different models. By 1865, his improved version featured 10 rotating barrels that could spit out up to 3,000 rounds per minute. Gatling returned to St. Louis to establish a manufacturing company for his steam tractor. While on a trip to New York, he passed away on February the 26th, 1903. Gatling is interred at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. On December the 5th, 1862, the 48th Indiana Regiment get organized, and I'll cover that history a little later on, as I've said. On January the 4th, 1863, the 35th Indiana Regiment returns to Indiana on furlough after suffering heavy losses during the Battle of Chickamauga during the September 18th of the 20th. 35th Indiana Regiment, also known as the 1st Irish, went into camp at Shell Mound in southwestern Tennessee. On December the 16th, 1863, the regiment re-enlisted as a veterans organization. It went on a well-deserved furlough, arriving in Indianapolis on January the 4th, 1863. The next episode will relate the raid by Confederate General John Morgan as he rampaged across the state in July 1863. Find out more about Indiana's role in the Civil War by purchasing my book. You will find it on the website www.mossyfeetbook.com on the Indiana Short History Series category. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online booksellers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebook or softbound versions. An audiobook version is also available on Google Play. At the conclusion of this podcast series, I will compile the episodes into an audiobook. The audiobook will be available on Audible, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, as well as many other audiobook sellers. You can listen to this podcast on many platforms, including Apple, TuneIn, Spotify, Amazon Music, and many others. Video versions are available on YouTube and Rumble. Southeast Indiana residents can also find my books at the Walnut Street Variety Shop at 111 George Street in Batesville, Indiana. You can also order these books direct from me, the author, on the webpage. If you wish me to sign the book, just send an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instruction on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want me to add you to the list, tell me and I will not add you. Listeners to this podcast that want email notifications of my new releases can just send an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my books. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening.